Wonderful. I will just do a brief intro of the two speakers and two leaders in smart cities, cybersecurity, and privacy. And then I will leave the experts take the floor. So first, this session is about smart cities cybersecurity trends and equity in action. As we know, is what the society has woken up to in the current years. And there are no better speakers than the two present here with us today. Professor McKnight from Syracuse University has been I joke that he's the media darling. Whenever there's a ransomware, for example, the recent Los Angeles school district, then the media people call him up and say, hey, what's your take? But behind that, of course, Professor McKnight has so much expertise in technologies as well as in adoption of technologies in his native, I don't know where you're from, but Syracuse, your resident city, Syracuse in New York. And Professor McKnight also has been a strong leader in the NIST-led initiative, GCTC, Smart Cities Initiative, with his expertise in cybersecurity and privacy. Thanks for joining us here, Lee. And with him, Albert Gehami, is that the right pronunciation?
There you go.
Oh, okay. As he was introduced to me, a shining star in the city of San Jose. Since you joined, the city adopted very quickly a very effective digital privacy policy. And now you are also collaborating or building up a collaboration with other local governments to push for even broader privacy initiatives. So I am all ears, Albert and Lee. The floor is all yours. Thank you for joining.
Thank you so much, Lan, for that warm welcome. And it's great to be having the opportunity to join and have a dialogue with Albert and with all of you participating elsewhere remotely in this event. Albert, maybe I'll say just a few more words. Again, I've been, as Lan mentioned, I've been collaborating with her and Cyber Trust America and NIST around the broader GCTC initiative, but also with the city of Syracuse and with other public and private partners in thinking through both security and privacy and rights in an inclusive way through an action cluster over the since 2019, actually. But we'll leave that for later because I think we'd all like to hear, coming from San Jose and your early work. Well, first, let's start with a little more background. Like somehow you didn't just like parachute into San Jose's city government. You have some background in roles that you got to before you landed in that role. Could you just elaborate a little bit more on where you're coming from?
Yeah, for sure, Lee. So I come into the privacy space from more of a data science background, which I think tends to be a little off the beaten path. A lot of privacy people tend to come into their roles from a legal background, thinking about it from, in California, right? We have a bunch of laws specific to our state, whether you think about the Consumer Protection Act, any other California laws that need to be navigated. But when we think about our local government and we think about all the legalese that needs to be figured out, that's been solved. Solved might be the wrong word, but navigated a lot by our legal team, city attorney's office. What really we were looking for, and this is why I really found interest in this role, was they needed someone who understood the data behind what we were using and how we were using it, how, we use the words AI, right? Models, algorithms, how that stuff really comes into play to use people's information to ideally provide something that improves their quality of life, but making sure that that's actually what's happening. So about 4 to 5 years ago now, I started with the city of San Jose as a data scientist, working primarily on how do we just make sure that the services that we're providing are being optimized and that they are equitable. So thinking along the lines of how do we provide youth intervention services for children across the city in an equitable fashion? How do we make sure that we're optimizing our fire emergency response times? And there's a bunch of cool projects that I could talk about there, but the point being, we did a lot of that great work. Left the city, worked for the state of California for about 2 years, helping with their data strategy, data privacy, and tooling up their with their California Public Utilities Commission, and then came back to the city to really run their privacy program. And I think, what run their privacy program, it varies between every city. Some people take much more of a, like I said, a legal, we take much more of a technical equity focus on it. The goal really being, we have all this technology that we want to develop, introduce, pilot, all these cool new initiatives that we want to try. How do we innovate in a way that brings all of our community members along? And making sure that the technology that we're using and the data we collect, residents understand what's going on, they support it, they believe in it, and really trying to take that type of community engagement and equity focused approach through privacy. And, we've really been doing that the last couple of years. I can provide more history later, but the investments have started to pay off, and I'm more than happy to talk about that, throughout. But that's a little bit about my background, and Lee, incredibly excited to be here talking with you and talking with the folks on the call.
Great. Well, again, we welcome people to jump in at any time as we go along. Well, I'll just sort of follow from that we go through a little bit of the background of what we've been doing here in the city of Syracuse and with NIST, and this could also be an example to other communities. So again, well, I'm going to return it back to you with a question also before long. But in 2019, we set up something we called the Community Smart and Secure, or Smart City and Community. That was the name of the program at that time in this GCTC. They keep changing the what exactly is the trendy algorithm or name branding, but that was it at the time. Smart City and Community Challenge, so it was SC3, and our action cluster, which I'll get back to defining in just a second, was community, cloud, privacy, security, and rights inclusive architecture. So we were coming in sort of, I think like where you and I are sort of on the same page, and there's a strong applied data science master's program in my school too, but let's think about the data, and let's think about data governance, and let's look at these aspects together for not just an individual small business, but at the wider community scale, how this might all work. And now I'll just pause on what's like an action cluster. An action cluster is something that listeners anywhere here could spin up their own community group to look at community privacy and or digital, data privacy and related issues, or data privacy and rights inclusive issues. And now we have to say, like at that time in 2019, when we put on this like very funky CPSRIA acronym for our group, this is saying, what are you talking about exactly? And why are you talking about privacy and security and rights inclusive for approaches altogether? Unfortunately, with George Floyd's murder and subsequent things, the obvious connection was apparent for everybody across the country. And I won't pretend that it was just myself. It was a strong leadership in the city of Syracuse, in the CIO's office, folks that were also like chief data officers that were supportive. And above that, the mayor, Mayor Walsh still, who had from the beginning launched the project for smart cities as an inclusive, we're all trying to bring all parts of the community together. So that's kind of like where I've been coming from and where we got to. And I'd say other communities can think about data, privacy, and rights as you're talking about as well together. But now we sort of get to say, how did San Jose, you said, yeah, you went away, you came back. Was there any sort of challenges in getting community support or buy-in for this kind of the approach you're taking, or was it because it's still, even though you say, yeah, California's has these laws and policies, but really there had to be some groups pushing back on trying to think about privacy? Because for a lot of the business community, let's be honest, it's still an afterthought. What challenges did you find in trying to go at the approach you're taking?
For surely. There's a lot there, and I'm happy to go through it. And also, however format we want to take, but also would love to hear about what that's looking like more on the ground floor for you. After I can explain a little bit on our end. But yes, we got pushback left, right, and center. Right, we got pushback from privacy advocates who, I think about the ACLU, NAACP, many other civil liberties organizations who, by default, have pushed for no data collection, no technology usage, as minimal as possible, right? Then you have on the other side, for example, our council, or at least our mayor and our city council offices tend to lean more into the tech optimism. With reservations, obviously, we're not blindly walking into things, but there certainly is an interest in using technology to support our communities. And then you have businesses who are really interested in how they can feel safer and more secure in their place of residences. Like, I think I'll give an example. This past year, we have seen a uptick in specifically hit and run accidents and in what we call smash and grabs, but I think this was more of a national trend of vandalism and destruction of places of business, especially Asian American places of business. Between that and just in a single intersection in the city, we had 3 fatal hit and run accidents. And, that's just one example. But the point being is, we've been seeing a rise, especially as people are coming back into, commuting, driving, right, from quarantine. We're seeing a lot of unfortunate traffic fatalities. And so there's been questions, and our council has been pushing for how can we add additional elements of security. So one of those elements, for example, is automated license plate readers, which just, for the folks at home, that is, you picture a camera, it's at an intersection. As soon as a vehicle passes by, it reads the license plate and it can tell you if the vehicle is stolen, if the vehicle is part of, say, an Amber Alert, Silver Alert, or some other crime that might be ongoing or might have happened, and this is useful for evidence gathering purposes. So when we wanted to roll out that technology, you've got all of these voices in the room where civil liberties organizations are entirely against it. They have concerns about the vendors. You have council trying to push for it. You have some people saying this is not a big deal at all. Why are we even concerned about the privacy elements? And really what pushed it all to a head was when we decided, and I work in, our privacy and our cybersecurity sits in our IT department, right? So when our IT department decided we are going to do public outreach, which I don't know about other people's IT departments, but going and doing, going out speaking to the community, it was relatively new for us and people were terrified of it. We had council members say, don't do that. You're going to get shot. This is not a good idea. But we took the risk. We went out. We just went into neighborhood association meetings. We brought translators where needed. And we just talked to members of the community about what the technology is doing, how it works. One of my favorite things to do, and I think is always a good idea, is what the camera sees. Like, show people what, if this mysterious object is collecting data on me, what does that data look like from its perspective? Showing how it's used, how it's not used, show how it's aligned with our city's privacy values and programs. So I think the biggest example for that, San Jose is a city of immigrants, making sure that we are doing everything in our power so that that data, none of the data that we collect ends up in the hands of ICE or any type of immigration enforcement. So when we had those conversations with the communities, you saw a huge about face in the messaging and how people were talking about it. Every time that we went to residents, to neighborhood association meetings, and I'm not just talking about, higher income neighborhood association meetings where I'm the only one that speaks English, or at least, chooses to speak English. You're getting these conversations where after we explain the technology and how we use it, they're like, oh, please put cameras here, here, and here, because those are the intersections where I feel the least safe, where cars are driving by dangerously, where kids are walking to school. That's where I want this technology. And so not only did we address the pushback, and you actually saw it in a lot of the news media that was happening, right? Local journalism, but our local media is not only recognition that we were addressing the privacy concerns, but also getting invaluable information from our residents about where they felt the technology should go. And that, when we started getting that type of engagement, we started to see a lot of the voices come closer to one another, and a lot of that conflict start to calm down. Now, obviously, there still is tension, there still is conflict, but being able to aggressively engage, and that's the way I think about it, is aggressively engage and make sure that we are the ones bringing the issues and talking about this stuff to residents, rather than it being found out by a third party trying to pull our information out from us. It allows us to engage with a conversation rather than it being accusation. I think that has been incredibly helpful as we think about both that particular technology, which was automated license plate readers, but also when we think about any other technology that's collecting data, right? When we communicate and engage first and foremost, and we take that information and use it to inform our privacy practices and our cybersecurity practices, it has been a complete 180 in how we have seen that type of rhetoric being used.
Okay, well, that brings forward an anecdote also from, I think I like this back and forth from New York to California, bouncing on comparable experiences. But also I was now speaking of facial recognition technology, which is another technology that brings many concerns around privacy and bias, and sort of especially racial bias, from NIST studies showing the data training exercises have been mainly on white people, or white male people, and especially, and not nearly as accurate, or with many false positives for other communities. So with that technology in particular, this is also coming forward in discussion on the role of facial recognition in smart cities and communities, at the same time as this Cloud Privacy, Security, Rights, Inclusive Architecture Action Cluster was being launched. And I give now the prior person in this hot seat where you are now, Sam Edelstein, was the chief data officer at the time. At one of our first meetings, he and I had talked about it, but he announced, essentially, I think he caught some of his city official colleagues by surprise, but he was sort of saying, okay, if we're going to work with you, we're going to work with Syracuse University, we'll work with NIST and these broader groups, and help us figure out what to do about facial recognition systems. And some of his other officials are saying, what? Wait a minute here. This is again a hot button issue, but it was ultimately, if we jump forward to what we have now, there's a let's see, I forget the exact name of it, but a surveillance technology working group of the community, with exactly the kinds of groups that you described in San Jose, where they're not just like on the sidelines, they're part of the system, where before the city of Syracuse buys or deploys some new technology, they got to hear from the community first to say, will this be helpful for us? Will it make a difference in our lives, or is this a bad idea? Getting our own efforts to go out in the community and get feedback were thwarted by the pandemic, where we had just preparing to go out and talk to community groups where they lived, with Syracuse University students helping as part of that process, spring of 2020, and we all know what happened spring of 2020, so we were unable to actually do that, but myself and other faculties and colleagues are looking forward to getting back face-to-face in the community going forward soon. So let's turn it back to you, Albert, to talk a little bit more about there's still the question. Let's go a little deeper on the privacy aspect here. So you're sort of saying you're coming in from a data science perspective, the law and a privacy compliance perspective. You started off, you almost said basically it's like a solved problem in California. It probably isn't in the rest of the country. So do you have some advice for communities across the country where because is it possible to sort of focus on the data when you don't have the compliance or data privacy laws in place as you do in California? What's your perspective?
There's a lot that you can do without it.
Mm-hmm.
And even if it doesn't apply to your state, you can still use it as a framework. So I'll tackle this from a few perspectives. One, Lee, you've been mentioning NIST, and I cannot recommend and agree with you more. NIST, their privacy framework, although it's kind of just a high level, in my opinion, the 5 elements that they have: identify your data, govern it, control it, communicate with people, and protect it. It's just a good start, right? And when I think about what I'm doing, and I think this is some context, and Lon was posting this in the chat, really where my role and where the leverage of our privacy office exists is through approval of software and technology purposes or purchases. So basically any procurement that we do, it goes through a technology review. Part of that technology review is privacy, and privacy, that's where I come in. And really when I'm assessing the technology, there's a few questions that I ask myself. First and foremost, what data is it collecting, right? If there's no personally identifiable information being collected, we don't really have much of a concern. But that can get kind of tricky as to what counts as personally identifiable information. Is a whole nother topic that we can talk about. But there's a lot of great work. Honestly, I would recommend looking at like the IAPP, the International Association of Privacy Professionals.
Mm-hmm.
They have some great insight on this. And then there's a lot of local governments that have their own frameworks published. So I can, for example, speak to San Jose. We have all of our approaches to privacy review, our precedent on privacy reviews, all on our website. If you just go to sanjoseca.gov/digital privacy, you can navigate and find it all there. But Seattle has some great stuff. Boston, New York, San Francisco, Oakland, Portland is getting there. If there's some great work in Syracuse, there's places where you can look to get some of the specifics and details there. But at the end of the day, it's really taking a hard look and making sure that, one, if we are collecting personal information, where is it going? A lot of people, at least in our experience, a lot of people they might trust your local government or they might trust your local city official, but they might not necessarily trust the vendors that you're working with. And this was a big thing for us as we were looking at some technology. There were particular vendors that the ACLU raised concerns about, that residents raised concerns about. And so it's making sure that if you have to go with a vendor, putting into place the controls that make them follow your policy. And so for us, we have our privacy and disclosure policy, which basically just lays out, it's our boilerplate language to make sure that vendors have to follow our privacy program or policies in the same way that we do. And these are all open documents. I'm more than happy to share. But the point being is, right, making sure that vendors follow it, making sure that we track who has access, making sure that there's an audit log, especially when it's personal information, on who accesses the information, and that there's a way for us to annually review this stuff. So, a lot of detail goes into that, especially when you think about things as questionable and as still, I would argue, depending on the use case, untested as something like facial recognition. I'm happy to get into the conversation on that, but that's kind of the 30,000 foot view there. Is really what I think it requires is you have someone who's willing to think about the privacy issues from the data governance, access, information collected perspective, have them be a part of your procurement review, and the details and the framework and all that, there are plenty of things out there that you can copy and just pull into your system.
Great. I do want to open it up and make sure we have time for questions coming from people listening in. Wanted to note, or maybe you'll perhaps brag a little bit about the approach we took in Syracuse, where you mentioned the American Civil Liberties Union several times. So when we launched the Secure, that Community Cloud Privacy, Security, and Rights Inclusive Architecture Action Cluster, now everybody's going to remember that name, I'm sure, with our own Cyber Trust America's Lan Jensen and myself among the co-chairs, along with the Chief Data Officer, your counterpart for Syracuse, Sam Edelstein, and there was a fourth co-chair from the start, Yusuf Abdul Qadir, who I was just on another Zoom with earlier today, who at that time was the Central New York Director for the American Civil Liberties Union. And I can say that when I wanted him to be sort of elevated alongside us as co-chairs, partly to show like we're completely serious about civil liberties and privacy and citizens' rights from the start. And I can give the city credit because it wasn't necessarily their first thought of the way to proceed, to have the Civil Liberties Union not only alongside, but helping sort of lead the effort from the start. But it certainly worked out, and it was certainly a positive experience for all. And I put in the chat room that surveillance technology policy developed by the city, and now it's just, to me, it's nice to see that it's like routinely, just like that's a way to do business now in Central New York. Is you want to do something, is it a surveillance technology? Okay, you get community input before anything happens, before there's any purchase decisions from the city or use of the technology, no matter what the vendors say. So with that, I want to make sure we have time for questions coming in from listeners. Are there anybody out there that has a question for us? I'll check the chat, see what we got.
While you're taking a look, Lee, I'll just echo your point. The city of San Jose has probably a similar thing, like we call it our privacy advisory task force. Mm-hmm. But you've got your ACLU, NAACP, your civil liberty unions, organizations, academia, business, and nonprofit sectors, and all of them coming together to provide that type of ongoing expert input. I couldn't agree more. I think that's an essential part.
Great. Okay, so we do have a question with regard to municipal data. Is it tricky to monitor and enforce if vendors are actually, adhering to policies? How is that done? I think that's a question for the guy in city government, not the professor. Albert, how do you do it?
Oh gosh, I wish there was a golden bullet answer there. The honest answer is it's tricky and it depends on the vendor. But the silver lining here is vendors are getting smarter and more sophisticated and better at this. So I'll give you one example. When we were going out for, like when police is looking now for some of their pilot technology for things like gunshot detection, automated license plate readers, other types of security features, the first thing that we're looking for is there an audit log of any time that the people access the information, anytime anyone accesses the information. Same thing goes for as we're looking for body-worn cameras. Same thing goes for this, that, and the third technology. The main thing, or the first thing that I think of is there an audit log of any time that anybody accesses it? 1. 2, where does the data actually sit? If it actually sits on city servers, this is a lot easier to track and figure out than if it, say, sits on the vendor's cloud. It can still work if it sits on the vendor's cloud, but that's where you need to be able to get things like assurances on how the data is encrypted. Is it encrypted in a way that, is there agreements in place that the vendor cannot access the data after it's all set up? We have our privacy and disclosure policy, and I'm happy to share that among other things, that basically just says, hey, we're going to follow this agreement. The data is owned by us, things like that. but it does depend vendor to vendor, right? And every vendor negotiation is going to be a little different. And it really matters about, well, how much does the vendor need to access the data versus us? In many cases, we just need our city staff to access it. But if we're, say, thinking about like translation services, well, we need the vendor to be able to access all of our data to be able to help us translate, right? So it depends on each vendor, but I'd highly recommend the core tenets are just making sure, like, one, the data is sitting on some secure cloud. There's an audit log of who can access it, and you have some legal agreement in place about defining how the vendor can access it.
I think that's a great summary there. But I want to go back for some of the. I totally understand what you're saying about the log, the data, the audit log, and its importance. But for some listeners that may not be coming from a data science perspective, or necessarily a cybersecurity log tracking perspective, could you just elaborate a little bit on what you mean there and why that's so important?
Yeah, for sure. So an audit log, and this is something that can be super. I mean, if you just imagine, if I have like a software, like for example, this software that we're all logged into, this crowdcast.io, if I on the back end of the system, crowdcast.io, was able to see every IP address that accessed crowdcast.io, and I could see every device that accessed it, when they accessed it, and what parts of the site they went to. That's what I mean when I talk about audit log. And functionally speaking, really what I'm looking for is like an Excel sheet that just tells me, oh, okay, Officer X accessed the data at 3 p.m. and he looked at this image. Officer Y used this video clip at this time, right? And that allows us to get ahead of any concerns around, is someone misusing the data? Is an IP address that's not in our system accessing the data? It's that type of stuff that we can get by seeing what we call an audit log, of just basically a list of devices that have accessed the system.
Okay, great. I think that's great information for folks to have. So Lance raised a question and quoted the Sun founder on privacy is dead. Scott McNeely said that many years ago. So we've been you're pursuing a dead profession for a long time already here, Albert. But still, what's your perspective on that? Obviously, we may not agree, but what's is privacy dead? Is there hope in this such a data-centric world where it is possible to track down exactly what somebody did with each piece of data over time?
I mean, there's a lot of incentive to say that privacy is dead when your industry relies on selling people's data. We'll say that. But look, if privacy is dead, we wouldn't be talking about it right now. And with the way I think about privacy, especially when we're thinking about a local government or just a government context in general, is how are we making sure that the data that we're using is used effectively, responsibly, and transparently? And all of those elements, whether my data is confidential or it's open, I'm using, open source, I'm buying the data from somewhere else. What matters is that we are being held accountable to be using it effectively and responsibly. So, that's going to be there regardless of whether the data is accessible to everyone or accessible to just a few people. And there is plenty of information that is still plenty private. But regardless, it's about how it's being used and who is using it. And that is always going to be a part of the conversation because, right now, who can use a lot of our data is like a very small subset of private companies. But anyways, sorry, I can don't need to talk more on that.
No, that's great. Again, we have just I think a few more minutes. Is there any last question coming from the audience for us? If not, I'll say I also obviously I can over time concern with privacy has I've had students at times say, no, sort of give up on it. And then 5 years later, students say, no, I care a lot about privacy. And certainly in the community, there's this aspect, as you just highlighted, Albert. Okay, who's controlling the data? Who has rights over it? How is this data being used? These are a lot of the questions that you're asking in San Jose, and city governments are asking in Syracuse and elsewhere across the country. And we can think of failed smart city projects where the community could not have that level of trust that there were city officials actually looking out for them and their data. And instead it was just the vendors with the free reign to do whatever they wanted. And that's where smart city projects, from my experience, often failed because they were not looking out for their citizens' own data and privacy and security interests and rights interests in a broader way. Okay, so we have one last question coming in from Kira, or maybe two questions here. Municipalities, collective groups looking at AI governance using audits prior to or after implementation. I think that's an Albert question.
Yeah. So this is tricky because most governments don't have someone that can just like go into the code or look at someone's GitHub and understand, oh, this is how the model's working, or this is the data that's being used to train the model for the AI. But what I can say, and this is probably the most important thing, any AI or model that we're thinking about, what it's doing is it's taking information, it's doing a thing to it, and it's giving us new information out. And while I might not be able to evaluate what's going on in the middle, what the algorithm is doing, I can ask questions about what information is going in and what information is going out. And I can see if the information going in actually reflects our population, right? I think Lee brought this up. If facial recognition data or facial recognition models are trained mostly on white faces, they're going to be really good at white faces and might not be good at other faces. And then on the output side, if I can look and see that my data is telling me things that are blatantly biased, I can figure that out by just seeing what the information is telling me. Like if I'm being told, oh, always go to this neighborhood because that's where crime is, and I know that neighborhood and I know, okay, well, that's a like highly immigrant population. There might be some bias going on here. You can figure that out. You don't need to know what's going on in the center to tell what's happening on the ends and asking your vendors what's going on there. You can ask from things like accuracy ratings. What are they trying to optimize their models for? Things like that. And I see the second question, Lee, if we want to just bounce to it.
Yeah, keep going.
Yeah. What do I think about differential privacy to protect citizens' data? Depends how you use it. But one of my favorite examples is, you want to understand where people are moving on a map, but you don't want to share their exact location. If you can, differential privacy, basically just change the data a little bit. Sure, it works. It's good. It's useful. I much prefer aggregating data than using differential privacy if I can and still use the same thing. But it's useful. I don't know. We might not have too much time to dig deeper into that, but
I think bad. I like that answer, and I think we're right over, or just 1 minute over, for our discussion time. So thanks so much, Albert. I've enjoyed the chat with you and with all of the folks listening in and participating with us over time. And we'll let us go to break and carry on with the program. Thanks again, everyone, and thank you, Albert.
Thank you, Lee. Take care.
Thank you, Albert and Lee. After this session, and best wishes on the effort, Albert, that you are leading with the support from McKnight Foundation and US McKnight.
Thank you.
And hello, everyone. We will have 2 sessions for today. One is our own business partners conversations about how to work together. Let's do something big and put the funding to good use, and which is going to be followed by another session. The renowned Professor Jonathan Rickenthal and Mayor Lily May, the happiest the mayor of the happiest city in the United States, will share with us their recent insights. So we will resume at 12:15. In 30 minutes, we'll come back. Thank you all.